Okay, good morning, colleagues. Thanks for attending this session on business human rights. I'll give the small technical details and introduce the session as we wait for colleagues to join in. My name is Sebastian Porter. I work in INPAD G1 and I work on the topic of business human rights. I see some familiar names in the list of participants, so welcome to you all. In terms of moderation, it's quite straightforward. We'll do two sessions of questions and answers, and you can ask your question in the chat directly. So there's no Slido, it's directly an interaction on the Zoom platform. Also, we have a SharePoint. I will put the link in the chat as well, and then we'll upload today's presentation, but also background documents there, so you can later on consult the documents or shuffle through the PowerPoint presentation later on if you have interest. Now, in terms of today's session, I think it's important to underline that we've been discussing this topic in previous seminars. And of course, this topic has grown a lot in recent years. So today's session is more of an internal perspective. I have colleagues from the ES. So I have Javier Martin Saracin from VMR3. Who's joining us and will give us more details about the current policy context. And then we also have Dan Van Thiel, who works in INPA E2, the unit that deals more on the private sector side, who will give us more details about the accompanying measures. So what do we need to do in terms of cooperation to sustain and support this topic? And it's also, let's say, natural evolution, because we have more guidance documents and we assume that colleagues are more acquainted with the topic. So this is a little the mindset that we have and the session that we are presenting to you. I think as well it's good to reflect business human rights to the words of our Director General, Kunduns. I think in his opening session, he referred to sustainability being Europe's new competitive advantage on the international scene. And we really believe that business human rights is a way to carry fundamental values, our vision of the world with Europe's, let's say, key economic trades. We are the biggest trading bloc and we want to, let's say, discuss our own values with our own strengths. So this is an important link we wanted to do. In terms of today's menu, the structure that we are proposing to you. Yeah, so we have first this discussion about the policy developments and also the legislative measures that are coming up. And then we propose to you a small discussion. So we want to hear from you about how do you see the impact of forthcoming legislation, internal discussion that you have at EU delegation level. I think it's important for us to also hear about your views so that we can also reflect on them. So it's really an interactive session. We've planned more time talking than presenting. So up to you to come up with the question is also an opportunity for you as much as for us. And then we have a third part, which is the accompanying measures. So this tackles more the cooperation side. And there as well, we will follow with a discussion on how to best support the implementation of the UN guiding principles at country level. And then here again, it's very important to reflect on what is important, what are the lessons learned, what have you learned from your experience, whether you've already implemented actions on this topic or you're still starting. So this is it. Without further ado, I'll give the floor to Javier, who will tackle the policy development before we will talk more about the forthcoming EU legislation on due diligence. Javier, the floor is yours.
Yes, thanks very much, Sebastian, and good morning to all colleagues that joined this session. Um, well, I mean, maybe since I would like to introduce the policy development, we need to start by explaining what is the current situation, and you can see there on the screen which are the, let's say, the international standards that apply in the area of business and human rights, responsible business conduct. But I would like to perhaps say a word on what is the current trend. And as many of you might know, based on your work, there is increasing interest in this area of human rights policy in recent years. Probably also based on increased knowledge on how supply chains and products are produced. In some cases, unfortunately, related to some scandals that have to do with how human rights are impacted by business activities. But I wanted to explain this element of increasing the importance of this topic with many initiatives going on within the EU and internationally. So perhaps having said this, I can explain what are the main standards that are the basis for policy development. And you can see first in the list is the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. This is the internationally recognized standard, which was endorsed actually by the Human Rights Council in 2011 by unanimity. This is a framework, let's say, that establishes the policies or the general policies that can be applied or that should be applied by both states and companies to promote responsible business conduct or the protection of human rights or in the context of business operations. And it's the authoritative framework for action. So there is overall support for this framework, and that you can see there what in the UNGP parlance is called the 3 pillars. So first there is a state duty to protect human rights, but there is also a responsibility of companies to respect human rights. And then a third pillar is the obligation to facilitate access to remedy when human rights abuses are produced in this context. So a key concept that was created by this instrument, by the guiding principles, is the concept of due diligence that probably you have heard, and it has to do. I mean, it's let's say one of the key or core concepts in this area because it let's say establishes the responsibility of businesses to check their supply chains and to know what are the production methods that they are using, what are the suppliers using to produce their products. Therefore, a responsibility of those businesses to know what is happening in their supply chains, both in the production of products or services. And then it takes me to the second international standard, which is the OECD multinational guidelines for multinational enterprises. And here the concept is the core concept is responsible business conduct, which is partially overlapping with the concept of business and human rights, but covering a bit of a wider agenda that has also to do with environmental issues and governance issues, etc. And here there is a bit of a more concrete or more operational description of what due diligence is about. So it provides, these guidelines provide concrete steps for businesses to check their supply chains, to engage with their suppliers, to know how the products are produced from the beginning of the chain. and to determine what is the level of responsibility that they have to assume to know those supplies and to act into supply chains and to act in case there are impacts or potential impacts on human rights or the environment or other sustainability aspects. And as you can see in the slide, there is a specific guidelines for sectors. Currently, there are guidelines on due diligence for 5 sectors: garment, minerals, extractives, agriculture, and financial services. So that's very much what companies use to really check their supply chains, and this is the main guidelines in this regard. And there is a third international standard, the ILO tripartite declaration. It's an important document because it's subscribed by governments, employers, and workers' organizations, and it promotes fundamental principles and rights at work, which are sort of core labor rights that companies need to comply with. So there is also very important issue. Maybe next slide, Sebastian. So just a word specifically on the business and human rights context and what is the state of play. So as I said, the guiding principles were adopted in 2011. So this last year was the 10th anniversary. And on this occasion, the UN published what they call a roadmap for the next decade. So establishing what are the priorities for implementation of the guiding principles in the coming years, based on the experience acquired in these last 10 years. And I will refer now to similar process that we are carrying out in the European Union, which is the comprehensive framework of UNGPD implementation, also taking a stock of what has been done in the EU in these last few years, and how we can better advance this agenda, and in particular how we can better enhance coherence. But maybe one word also for developments at international level. And you can see there the reference to international legally binding instrument, which is at a draft stage. There is no yet such agreement on such an instrument. There is a process that is ongoing since 2015, and the EU is participating or partially involved in this process. But there is still, let's say, there's a bit of lack of agreement internationally to what should be the core content of this instrument. So there are discussions ongoing in Geneva. Our colleagues in the delegation are following. But just the message is that we see, as EU, we participate in the process because we see a potential for such an international instrument or treaty. But this is still it's a difficult process because there is no international agreement on what should be the basis, including from like-minded countries which are not so involved. But just on the European Union, I mentioned the reference to the comprehensive framework. The idea of that initiative is to, let's say, translate what will be the priorities that the UN set for the implementation of the guiding principles to the EU. And this, for instance, this could translate, I mean, this is a process that is ongoing, and we are still reflecting on what should be the content of that comprehensive framework. But the idea is that we will help policymakers in the EU, and I will include also you in delegations, what would be possible actions to better implement the guiding principles at various levels, national, European, international. And a key instrument in this regard that member states have developed is the National Action Plans on Business and Human Rights. So, for instance, one of the possible actions under that comprehensive framework would be to set benchmarks for what would be the level of ambition that the National Action Plan should have, and what would be the, let's say, the ambition that as EU we would like to have in this regard. And one of the key concepts of the guiding principles is the concept of a smart mix. This means that what is necessary to protect human rights in the context of business activities is not only policy measures, is not only legislative measures, but it's a combination of both. So I refer to national action plans, but also it's important to refer to legislation, and we will now explain a bit more in detail the initiative on due diligence. But just I want to pass this message that the guiding principles require that the type of measures that are promoted by states and also, let's say, implemented by companies is both regulatory and non-regulatory, legislative and non-legislative. So perhaps I think we can pass to the description of the initiative on due diligence. I think Sebastian will explain will make the introduction on this.
Okay, thank you, Javier, for the quick recap about the policy environment this subject is embedded in. So, of course, one of the main key of attention, not only in Brussels, but also in other capitals, is the forthcoming proposal by the Commission for Directive on Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence. So this was put on the table on February 23rd of this year. Probably you have heard of it. If you haven't, then you're at the right place, and it's great that you're here to actually understand more about the potential impact of this proposal. So I will tackle the context, the why, and Javier will speak more in details about the what, who, and when. So why? It's quite straightforward. No, the EU as a whole is committed to the SDGs, but also has signed the Paris Agreement. So we are full on sustainable development, and this was reflected at the start of this Commission's legislature with the Green Deal, which actually gave an impetus. Political impetus on the topic. So there were different strategies and action plans that were drafted very early on, which set forward the legislative horizon for this commission. You see here on the slide, there's a few names. The EU Action Plan on Human Rights and Democracy, you're very acquainted with, but the proposal itself found its origin in the action plan on circular economy, on the farm to fork strategy, but also the renewed sustainable financing strategy. So it has roots in many different documents, and I think this reflects a little the broad scope that the legislation will have overall. So the Commission started a study, a very long study, but also a consultation with a whole wide range of stakeholders, being civil society organization, but also business. And it generated a lot of attention. You see here, it's more than 500,000 of responses during the public consultation, but also the Council, Member States, and the European Parliament were also very active through self-initiated reports, but also specific Council conclusion. And then there were also a lot of surveys by businesses and NGOs that actually showed that they were very much in favor of a legislative initiative in this area. Now, what were the key consideration or principles when the Commission drafted the proposal? There are a few, and I think they're important to reflect on. First, the culture of no harm. This is the idea that a specific legislation on corporate due diligence could actually enhance a corporate culture so that company would abide stronger to environmental, but also human rights standards. And this is the key step of thinking that voluntary initiative by companies itself have not proven to be sufficient. Therefore, regulation can really step up the game of not only the leading companies, but the companies falling behind. Another key argument was to avoid defragmentation in the single market, and that one rule could bind us all, let's say. It's a little like Lord of the Rings, but many countries France, Germany already had enacted legislation in this area. Netherlands had the legislation on child labor, and other countries, for example, Belgium, Luxembourg, already indicated a willingness to legislate in that direction. So it was important that the EU has its own rule very early on. There was also an important consideration for consistency. As I reflected, there are many other action plans and strategy that were taken early on, and that actually led to other legislative initiatives, for example, on sustainability reporting of financial products and financial agents. But there are also lex specialis, so due diligence rules in specific sectors, whether it's conflict minerals, batteries, or products linked to deforestation. So it was very important to have a legislation which had an holistic approach to bring all these different initiatives together. The other point is about legal certainty, and this is something that actually came from companies themselves. So in order to set a certain level of predictability in the market, it's better for companies to abide to the same rules. So this was also another call for having this proposal on the table. In terms of transparency, this links up to the other piece of legislation that concern financial markets. Investors themselves are very demanding to have more information about the impact of their own investments on the ground, whether they are environmental and social, and therefore tackling the actions of companies could really bridge that gap between investments and developments on the ground, because companies themselves are directly recipient of these investments, but also to ensure that consumers themselves can access information, as there's more consumer demand for sustainable products overall. So this legislation came in anticipation to that. Another key element was the issue of proportionality. This is linked to costs, but it was very important to take into account the potential impact on SMEs, because implementing due diligence at their level is more of a burden. So it was important to reflect this in the rules. And then finally, the idea of collaboration. I will let Dan in the second part of the presentation tackle this, but it's the idea that through legislation, we can set up more collaborative approach for business association or sectors as a whole to cooperate and make sure that everyone abides to the same standards, but also to reduce costs at individual level. In terms of benefits, I'm not going to go so much in details here. There's a clear case for sustainability. There's also a clear case to abide and as a company to be responsible with regards to human rights. This is referred in our guidance documents that we'll speak about in the second part of the presentation. But basically, for citizens, we all know protection of human rights has a lot of benefits in terms of rule of law, stability, ownership of rights, economic prosperity. But also for companies, they have better control of their supply chain. They are more attractive employer. It's more stability in a high-risk environment, customer loyalty, better access to finance. And here we see the link with the increased interest of financial investors to ESG standards, for example. So there's a long list of benefits there for companies as well. And then for partner countries, there's also a benefit in terms of enhanced partnership on key sustainable issues. I mean, it's a no-brainer that climate change impacts us all. So this legislation, in a way, bring us to the same level in terms of solution that could be, provided in terms of responsibility for all actors in global supply chains. And finally, on impact, I'll be very short here. It's the study of the Commission showed that the implementing due diligence would cost, in average, 0.01% of their total revenue. So it's really low compared to what they actually, the revenue that they make. And so therefore it was considered as possible to put this rule in place. Just a little a side note, the same cost is 15 times higher for SMEs. And this is, again, the link to proportionality that the legislation itself would have to cater for the specificities of SMEs and the burden that this will be put on them. I'll leave it to that. Javier, the floor is back to you on the nitty-gritty of the proposal itself.
Yes, thank you very much, Sebastian. So, as you can see on the slide, the idea is that now I let's say explain who is covered by this legislation, what are the specific obligations, how they should perform those obligations, and I will add a word also on what happens, what could happen if those obligations are not fulfilled. So, I mean, you can see there that yes, in this slide, you can see that the concept is due diligence is a full supply chain concept. So it goes from the raw materials until the product is or the service is provided to the customer. So it covers all the steps in the supply chains. And I think this is a concept that is important to keep in mind now when I explain the details. Now you can pass to the next slide. Thank you. So who is covered by the obligation? There are basically two groups of companies. So LLCs, limited liability companies. First group is, let's say, the largest companies, so more than 500 employees and a turnover of more than 150 million. So those conditions are cumulative. And then there is a second group of companies that is more than 250 employees. So the conditions there are 250 employees and more than 40 million of turnover. This second category is only applicable to companies that operate in high impact sectors. I will explain in a moment which sectors are we talking about. But you can see on the slide that we made a distinction between EU companies and non-EU companies. And basically there is, I mean, you can see the figures there. The large majority of companies that will be covered are EU companies. So this, we calculate that there is around 13,000 companies that will be covered by the obligations, whereas outside the EU is something around 4,000 companies. And it's because the core of the obligations apply to companies that operate in the European market. But of course, this has an important external dimension, and so you operate also with delegations. It's not only the non-EU companies that is important, but also let's say the suppliers of EU companies that should be taken into account. So I want to just emphasize on this point that we need to not only think in terms of EU or non-EU companies, but also what are the business relations that EU companies have. There is also a point on SMEs, small and medium enterprises. And as you can see there, the proposal does not directly concern them, so that means they are not directly covered by the obligations, but indirectly they will be also affected because, as I said, this is a full supply chain approach. Many of the suppliers or distributors or companies that are, let's say, in the environment of companies that are covered by these obligations are SMEs. So somehow they will also be affected. And this was one of the most controversial issues during the discussions, whether companies, small or medium companies should be included or not in the scope. So they were not included, but just for you to be aware, they will be somehow affected. Next slide, please. So as I said, the second group of companies is what we have called high impact sector companies. And these are basically three: garment and footwear, agriculture, and minerals and extractives. I will not go into the enumeration of the concrete elements there, but basically just for you to know that as we said at the beginning, this is the full supply chain. So from the extraction of the raw materials until the, let's say, the selling or the provision of the service. Next slide, please. So what are the exact obligations? So the proposal is called on corporate sustainability due diligence, but there is also an aspect of directors' duties. So what is the difference? The due diligence duty of a company is, in essence, is the obligation of the company to identify and address potential or actual impacts that that company can have on the environment and on human rights. And this applies to their own operations as a company, but also to the possible impact that the subsidiaries can have, and also what has been called the established business relationships. This is a concept that is a bit controversial, but in essence, what it tries is to limit what is, let's say, the responsibility of companies, and it has a component of duration. So for a company to have a established relation with another one, it has to have a certain duration in that relationship, but also it has to be related, that relationship, to a core activity of the company. As I said, this is a controversial element because it's not so clear what are the limits. But I think it's important because it limits somehow the responsibility of companies, because it will be difficult to argue that they should be responsible for all, let's say, small relationships that they have with others, all the companies. And then there is also an element of obligations for directors. So they have, in essence, they have to set up processes to incorporate the due diligence obligations to the company's operations, and also to reflect this in the company's strategy. And they have to report this to the board on a regular basis. And there is this concept of duty of care, which is, I think, is quite important because it has to do with the culture of responsible business. So they, like managers of companies, they will need to integrate considerations on human rights and environment when taking decisions or when considering what is the best interest of the company. And this is a bit of a cultural change that I think, well, when I refer at the beginning of this trend of change in this sector, I think it's important because it changes a bit like the conception of what is the role of a company in society. And one word on climate change, because the companies in group one, so the large companies, will also need to integrate in their strategy objectives that are related to the fulfillment of the obligations under the Paris Agreement when it comes to climate change, and including of possible objectives for reducing emissions. So this is an important point that has also been considered in this initiative, because as we explained before, it concerns not only human rights, but also environmental standards. Next slide, please. So what are this is the famous 5+1 or 6-step framework developed by the Oecd, which is the core of due diligence. And there are like 5 or 5+1 steps, as we call it, what companies need to do. So first, they need to integrate responsible business conduct into their management system and policies. As a second step, they need to put in place mechanisms to identify the impacts of their operations, but also their subsidiaries and business relationships, I will explain before. Third, if an actual or potential impact is identified, the company needs to take measures to prevent or to mitigate the impact, or to mitigate or stop it. Then, in a fourth step, they need to track what are the results of those measures. So whether the impact is actually addressed and reduced, mitigated. And five, they need to communicate this publicly. So they need to be transparent on what are the measures that they are adopting to address the impact. Finally, there is also a sixth step, which is when appropriate, they need to cooperate or directly provide for remedy for the victims of the impacts of their operations. So this is an element that is important, access to remedy. I will refer to it in a second, a bit more in detail. Please, next slide, please. Well, just this is a bit to give you a bit more of clarity, but we basically explained what was a bit the difference between Group 1 and Group 2. In Group 1, they will have companies will have a full obligation to carry out due diligence, whereas in the second group, it will be for let's say we call them the high impact sector. So it will be an obligation to address severe adverse impacts related specifically to those high risks that the companies are involved in. And the obligations will apply 2 years later than to Group 1, just to give more companies more time to adapt to it. And then, as I explained, the obligation related to the Paris Agreement will apply only to Group 1. There is also obligations related to the CSRD reporting. So this is a proposal also, which is not yet adopted. So this might change a little bit. What are the exact obligations? But this basically is the obligations of companies to report what are the impacts on sustainability aspects, social, human rights, environmental, etc. And then the duty of care I already explained before. Next slide, please. Yeah, so just a final word on access to remedy or enforcement, because this is, as I explained before, this is the third pillar of the guiding principles, and somehow is the element that is more underdeveloped at the moment. So what happens when there is an impact? What are the possibilities to communicate this and to seek for remedy in case there is a responsibility from the company? So the proposal includes an obligation of the companies to set up a complaint mechanism, which can be used by the affected person, the trade unions, or civil society organizations. Then there is also an obligation of member states to set up supervisory authorities and able to impose administrative sanctions. So this is let's say a first way of enforcement, which is, let's say, public enforcement. And in order to have some harmonization in the EU, there is also foreseen a European network of supervisory authorities. So there is no big differences between the sanctions that companies might have in one member state as compared to others. So these supervisory authorities will share best practices, and they will try to ensure a good level of harmonization across the EU. And finally, there is a very important aspect of the proposal, which is the possibility of private enforcement. So what we call civil liability. This means that the persons affected by the impacts on human rights or the environment, they could take companies to court. This is important to clarify that the company responsibility is limited to an obligation of means. So it's not only if the let's say the operations of the company result in an impact, but then it needs to be analyzed if the company is responsible for that impact. So if they have put in place the mechanisms to avoid it, the necessary mechanisms to avoid that impact, there will not be such as liability or responsibility because the company has complied with their obligations. As we explained before, this will apply also to responsibilities of subsidiaries and established business relations. But it's important also to clarify that the burden of proof is on the claimant. So those that allege an impact need to prove that the company is responsible for that impact. Maybe there are some questions from this aspect, so we're happy to reply to any questions on this regard. But I think that's it from my side. I think I now pass the floor back to Sebastian to continue the presentation. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Javier, for this very all-encompassing presentation. I think we went in detail, and this is also the time for to hear views or opinions, or insights. What do you expect at delegation level? I think it's always good to reflect on this together. Maybe Javier, one question while colleagues are thinking. When is in terms of calendar, when do you expect this proposal to be adopted? What's the kind of power play between the Parliament and the Council on this proposal? And then there's also a comment from Mariana. Maybe you want to reflect it orally. I think it touches upon the obligation throughout the whole chain for companies to implement due diligence. So you said that it's important to make sure that we, companies don't resort to other type of suppliers because the rule doesn't apply to everyone. Maybe you can reflect on this. But first, Javier, maybe quickly you could respond to that question, and then Mariana, if you want to take the floor, you're welcome.
Yes, thanks. So in terms of timing, well, it's difficult to say a very concrete timing. What I can maybe refer to is the state of play of the discussions in Parliament and Council. So in Council, there have been several meetings already. Discussions are advanced relatively quickly because there was an interest of the French presidency to bring this forward quickly. But in Parliament, also partially due to the very strong interest on this initiative from several committees, the process is a bit slower. Actually, the rapporteurs were just appointed. The formal discussions have not started. So that means that probably, I mean, for sure, we will need to be looking to next year. I think will be the most realistic timeline. So it will be difficult that this is finalized this year, among other things, because there are still many aspects that are controversial. So I think realistically, we should think of next year as a possible date of adoption.
Okay, great. Thank you. Mariana, do you want to take the floor?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Sebastian. Yeah, just to reinforce, I think this point of the stable relationships, stable business relationships with suppliers, it has been pointed by many civil society organizations, by even a representative of workers in Bangladesh. Especially in the case of the garment industry, it's really critical because in the garment industry, they already have most of their supply chains is not stable business relationships with suppliers, So this would be a huge gap in this directive and in the possibility of this directive to have a positive impact. And may actually bring even negative consequences, because then companies can simply have a pool of suppliers that are not, not stable relationships, and then they simply don't do the due diligence. Of course, I mean, if companies more advanced in this. They know that the importance of sustainable supply chains, and some companies wouldn't fall on that, but others with lower standards, yeah, they could, you know. So I think it has been pointed out a lot already, and yeah, it's really critical for it. I think it's a point that should be improved.
I think it's a very, very valid point. And in all this legislative discussion, I think the many opponents to the proposal were also flagging the possible risk in terms of de-risking, you know, that companies would just want to bail out and say, okay, we don't want to conduct work or business in this area because it's too risky and it's too much work to engage with suppliers. But yeah, so the obligation is throughout the whole chain. And of course, in the spirit of the guiding principle, it's always the constructive engagement first. So, you know, you engage with your suppliers on the high risk that you've identified, and then slowly you set up processes to tackle them. And of course, yeah, you work with some suppliers, but you shouldn't in your mapping avoid the other suppliers that are around, or the suppliers in tier 2, tier 3, and the more you go down, the more you hit the informal economy. So I think the trickle down effect is there, and it's good, but it's important to keep in mind that we you know, there's a lot of work ahead to make sure that the legislation or company effort touch upon everyone. And I think Dan will reflect on this on accompanying measures, because in terms of cooperation, there's a lot to do there. Of course, but thanks for this point. I don't know if there are, I don't know if there are other questions. I don't see any hands. Maybe I'm blind in Zoom. I have a question for Javier. So there's no one. I'm ready.
I think Geneva wants to ask a question.
Okay, maybe quickly before we head to Dan. Salvatore, you have a remark? Maybe you.
Thank you, Sebastian, and thank you very much, Javier, for this opportunity to share the state of play and important information on our internal work. I have a question regarding the sector, but also responsibility and then access to remedy as a clarification. Regarding the sectors, you mentioned that, of course, the proposal at the moment covers some sector, agriculture, garment, and I was wondering if the big multinational also include the big tech companies, and to what extent. I assume that it will apply automatically to those that work in the digital sector. Then responsibility. Of course, there is a responsibility for corporate due diligence, but also the director duty of care you mentioned. What about the responsibility of those that usually are big companies that are the shareholders' responsibility, if to some extent they are also involved in duty of care, shareholders, or they do have to a certain extent a responsibility for violations and abuses committed by these multinationals, especially for those big multinationals that operate in the EU market and owned by foreigners. Let's think about Chinese, or even stay owned by those foreign countries. And then regarding the access to remedy, I was wondering if the European, regarding the administrative supervision, the European networks of supervisory authorities, if this, at least in the proposal, the idea is to have it somehow similar to the OECD national contact point, and to what extent they will create synergy with and not overlapping with what the OECD is already foreseen as national action contact point. So thank you very much again for all your efforts on this, to both of you. Thanks.
Thank you, Salvatore. I think these are very science questions. Javier, do you want to try to answer them first and then try to back you up here?
Yeah, happy to go first. Thanks, Salvatore. On sectors, just to clarify, the sectors we refer to are for a second category of companies, so the group 2. So large companies, but a bit less, not the largest companies. So the group 1 is not covering only specific sectors. Group 1 is covering all sectors. So in this regard, you refer especially to the digital or to big tech. Yes, the reply is yes. Those companies are covered because they will be part of group 1. Therefore, all sectors are covered under group 1. Then on responsibility of shareholders. Well, I mean, I understand the question, but I think I will put it in the other way around. I think this is more about what is the responsibility of the company or the managers towards their shareholders, because the management decisions that they take in this regard that might affect the company itself, and therefore shareholders might be affected. So the rights of the shareholders might be affected if a company is not complying with these obligations. But let's say more generally, and I think this is an important aspect, what we explained before is that there is a bit of a shift in the perception of what is the role of a company in society and what is the responsibility that companies need to have towards society in general, including towards their shareholders. But I mean more largely towards communities in which they operate, etc. And I think this is a bit the background that is underlying all these initiatives, and in particular the Diligence initiative. So I think it's important that to keep in mind how this change of culture is embedded in concrete measures like the diligence obligations and the obligations of directors to take into account larger interests beyond their stakeholders or their stakeholders' interests. So from shareholders, not only shareholders' interests, but also, let's say, stakeholder interests, if we can put it in those terms. And then finally, on the last one, well, every member state will be free to determine who should be the competent authority for implementation. So it might be the possibility that national contact points under OECD are the competent authority, but somehow their knowledge will be integrated or will be shared with the competent authority if they are not the direct competent authority. But there is a bit of flexibility in that regard. So the proposal is not indicating who should be the competent authority, it's for member states to decide.
Thank you, Javier. Maybe quickly on the shareholders, I think there's no legal link, but there's a link as an investor. So not only a lot of investors are paying attention to social environmental standards, but they have to report on to the customers. And also the idea that if a business do abide to the guiding principles, it should perform better economically, then you also have that financial incentive that actually there's more return for shareholders if the company does the whole due diligence work better, because it's less liable, it's less under reputational risk. So I think this referred to the business case that we presented early on, that there's a win-win situation for everyone, and then an incentive for shareholders to actually choose the companies that perform better. I'll leave it to that. Thank you for that question, Salvatore. It was quite specific. Maybe I'll pass the floor to Dan to tackle the concept of accompanying measures, because I think it relates well to our work and how we design actions, and why both are linked. because the link might be stronger than you might initially think. So Dan already presented you early on, but Dan works for INPA E2, so our sister unit, I would say, that delves on private sector issues. So the floor is yours. I'll just share the presentation.
Thank you very much, Sebastian. Yeah, sorry, I was a bit late in this meeting because I was still dealing with some other stuff. But thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to present the accompanying measures to the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, which, as Javier just explained, is still a draft. But this doesn't stop us from already thinking about designing these new accompanying measures to support the implementation of the directive, in a way exactly because the risk Mariana has just explained, to mitigate these risks and to ensure the effective implementation of the directive on the ground. The legal, next slide please. The legal text actually of the C3D has specifically refers to accompanying measures. So that's Article 14. It says that member states shall set up and operate dedicated websites, platforms, or portals. But in practice, partially they have already done this, but I think also it's very important to do this together with the European Union and DG INPA and DG GROW in particular. Next slide, please. So to do this effectively, we need to have a clear range of the different actors in a supply chain, the rules, policies, and standards that are already in place, such as the UNGPs, but also the OECD guidelines, and the different mechanisms. We're already discussing these topics, such as in the G7, G20, but also with member states bilaterally. And then we need to look at the support functions. So, and this is very important, right? Because the goal in the end is is that the C3D will be one of these tools to strengthen the ecosystem in partner countries, so that in effect the legislation and the social and human rights and environmental standards will be improved in partner countries. So next slide, please. So we've already did a mapping of, because all this, I mean, this is basically what Javier has also explained, and Sebastian, all this, the whole C3, it's not new. We've been doing this on a voluntary basis for a long time already. But what is new now is that the whole due diligence part will become mandatory for business, for in-scope business. But this doesn't mean we have to start from scratch. Has already been ongoing projects, both with member states, but also within the European Commission. So the first step that we did was mapping what is already there. And we found 75 ongoing European Commission projects on making supply chains more sustainable, with a budget of over 660 million euros. So we did this mapping and analyzed what's in there. Next slide, please. And we actually found 8 different categories of projects. These 8 different categories are information and guidance on due diligence process and legal requirements, practical tools for supply chain management, risk assessment and reporting, global policy dialogue, international coordination, research, industry collaboration and stakeholder engagement, producer supplier capacity building and empowerment, impact investment and supply chain finance, regulatory environment and support ecosystem in partner countries, and transparency, advocacy, consumer awareness raising. So all these 8 different categories of accompanying measures are very important in the end to ensure the effective and sustainable implementation of the C3D on the ground. Going back to Mariana's comments, this is exactly what we're trying to avoid, is disengagement of producers and or higher costs on the ground for the factories, for the workers, or for the farmers. So the goal in the end is, because what does this mean in the sense effective implementation on the ground, is that the lead firms are investing and engaging within their supply chain with all the producers and other actors within the supply chain. So, and especially investment and long-term engagement is key to, in the end, improve the conditions on the ground. And all these 8 different categories support this ultimate goal. So that's very important. I'm sure you have a lot of questions about this as well. So I'll continue and then we can discuss it later. So next slide, please. So what I just said was the mapping of ongoing projects, but we're also in the process of developing new accompanying measures, because we identified some gaps in the former or in the existing programming. So we'll be designing new accompanying measures on 4 different levels, actually. So at a global level from Unit E2, but also together with Sebastian, we're designing these new tools under the global challenges, AEP 2022. And we're looking to do this together with the OECD, ILO, and ITC. And the stuff you need to think about then is actually data collection, create a baseline and benchmarks to see what in a couple of years, what will be the result of this legislation, and does it actually have a positive impact or a negative impact, but also creating alignment tools for existing sector schemes. So again, what I said, it's not new what we've been doing. There has been done a lot also by business already. And we need to see how we can build upon this and these existing standards or private sector initiatives. We need to see how we can line those with the C3 to create synergy and coherence. And this also impacts the business at farmer level or production level, because nowadays they have to sometimes comply with 8 or 10 different audits schemes. So it would be very good if we have just one sort of audit program, and auditing is just one part of the whole legislation. But here we can already see some possibly low-hanging fruit where we can improve the situation also for the farmers. So it does not necessarily mean that this whole legislation will create more costs, but sometimes could also lead to less costs. And at a global level, we're also doing the human rights thematic programming, and in that sense, again, we're working closely with Sebastian's unit. So at the regional level, this is at INPA, our geographical colleagues. They're already doing a lot as well. Under the ACP, we're doing a pilot with ITC to actually see how what does this mean in practice, the whole due diligence application. So we're working there together with all the stakeholders and actors within the supply chain. And the idea is that we will get results for this by the end of the year to see what are the opportunities, what are the risks, and where do we need to be extra careful. Again, we're doing this at these pilots in different countries, or we're thinking of doing it in different countries because the local context is very important, and this is where we need the help of delegations as well. And we've seen that 66% of the country MIPS includes supply chain sustainability among their priorities. And in that sense, we need to create synergy as well with the local programming and these global programs. So this should be a continuous dialogue between this to see both a bottom-up approach, but also a top-down approach to see where, how can we reinforce each other. So if you have any questions on your local programming, please also reach out to either Sebastian or myself to see where we can help and build on the lessons learned and best practices we already have. And then finally, there's a Team Europe approach where we want to create a one-stop shop together with the member states both for a one-stop shop with two entrances, as we say, one for EU business and one for business and governments organizations in partner countries. Another goal of this is in a sense to coordinate between the different member states. And then the next slide, please. So to give you more information about mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence, and to create effective accompanying measures for this, we have written a large report, I would say, or a guidance document for the delegations and other implementing partners. So I think it'd be good to share with you this report after the presentations. And to make it more accessible, we also wrote a 4-pager, which in a sense summarizes the whole due diligence process. So please have a look at this, and again, reach out if you have any questions. And I think now it's back to you, Sebastian.
Thank you, Dan, for this overview of accompanying measures. I think it's good that we have guidance documents so that colleagues can deepen the understanding of the topic, but also envision what they could do at country level. And the guidance document done by your unit, I think it's quite straightforward in this regard. Also good to remind that we also have the toolkit on business human rights. This was actually discussed in the last seminar session just before the pandemic hit us, but it was published early last year. And then it just gives a more strategic overview of the topic in development cooperation, meaning how does it, how could it be covered for different cooperation modalities, but also how to bring out business human rights as a cross-cutting topic. Because Dan, I think you reflected on the smart mix of measures, the fact that it touched upon many different areas. Therefore, at delegation level, many colleagues should be aware of the legislation, what's coming up, and how the different funding could come with one and another. So I think this also reflects what Koen said in the opening about avoiding working in silos. So the toolkit kind of reflects on this, and also how to further engage with the different type of stakeholders involved, whether it's business, state authorities, but also civil society. And I think this reflects the theory of change that is presented in the toolkit, that there are different stages in terms of engagement, coordination, support to be given as the legislation unfolds. So we're still in the first stages. The proposal is there, people should be aware, but the proposal has not been enacted. So once we get there, there will be more and more expectations. And then after the 2 years of grace, if we want, for the high-risk sector, there will be more expectations. So we should also keep in mind that there are different deadlines coming up. And I think this was it for our presentation. We still have some time left for questions and answers. I think it would be good to reflect more in terms of work at delegation level, what has been done or what you haven't done or thinking of. Maybe while colleague reflect on this, maybe Dan, could you explain a little more the link between the TI, because we say it's a global TI, it concerns global supply chains. How does it affect the work of colleagues at country level? Do we also expect that they should seek more coordination of action with member states in specific countries?
So yeah, I mean, it's like I said, the Team Europe initiative has 2 goals in a sense. One is to create this one-stop shop, and the other thing is creating coordination between the different actions of the Commission and the member states. But I think at the local level, talking to the local delegations and embassies, it can also really help us to find synergy between the different programming. So because this CSRD and this topic, it is really cross-cutting and also cross-national. So I think to see where we can find synergy again, it will be crucial to really have an effective and sustainable implementation to do this legislation right. And I think accompanying measures are key to do this, and to avoid the possible negative impacts of the legislation.
Great. Yeah, I think it's good to keep an eye on this TI and how it will shape up and be discussed, because it's also a momentum for further action at country level. I don't see any hands raised or people willing to intervene. Luckily, I see there's some people, and I'm sure they could intervene, because we have, I'm going to designate people if no one is willing to come up forward. But yeah, voilà, okay, I see Katal is there, and I think it would be interesting to hear from your work, because Uganda is quite a special case, and it has its own, has done work on business and human rights, but not just under the thematic programming, but under country programming. And it has embedded work on business human rights with other work to support sustainable business. So I think it would be nice to hear from you. And I see that you have a question or comment, so we are all ears. Katal, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Sebastian. Yes, I hope you can hear me all okay. Good morning, everybody. My name is Cathal Gilbert, and I'm a program officer at the delegation in Uganda. And yeah, thanks very much, first of all, for the presentations and the sessions. Very interesting and useful. We are looking forward to the directive, obviously. And as Sebastian said, we do have it's a component in a bigger action related to sustainable business that directly relates to business and human rights. So through that, we have an allocation of 5 million euros. It's not enormous, but it's also good. I think a good starting point for us. It's the first time in Uganda that we have an action specifically on business and human rights, and the intention is to build on the government's policy framework. Uganda became the second African country to adopt a national action plan last year. And so that's a good entry point for us. We also have a platform of European and Ugandan businesses that is ready-made, that already exists, set up as a part of a Team Europe initiative that we can work with businesses. And then finally, there are a range of active civil society organizations on the ground here that have been working on the topic for some years. So I think the ground is well set. The action will work across all of three of those components. And the intention really is to advance certain components of the National Action Plan, really raise awareness amongst the business community. I mean, in our scoping around this, we were a bit surprised at the low levels of awareness amongst companies on the UN guiding principles, for instance. Even big international companies, their operations here in Uganda seem not to be aware of that framework, and so I think there's a lot of work to be done there at a very, very basic level. But I think it is, and we've had a number of engagements already on the topic with businesses, and they seem to see some value in it for themselves. So I think it's not a very hard sell for companies here in a number of sectors, including the three sectors we're focusing on: the digital sector, the agricultural sector, and then sectors with we say large numbers of employees. So we will have a focus on labor rights, work, and I think that what we've seen is that the businesses see a lot of value in connecting to this agenda for their own operations, for reputational, but also sort of future proofing. And I think because they know the directive is coming, it gives us another added way to engage them in a conversation. And I think there's good involvement from member states. So we have Belgium is very centrally on board, also France, and Germany through GIZ. So there's good member state involvement here in Uganda. So that's just an update on what we've been doing. We will obviously follow the developments very closely, and it's good to know about the global TEI as well. It'd be interesting to know if we could connect with that somehow. And we're looking forward to having this action up and running early next year. The one question I had, and this may be an informed question, but I'll ask it anyway. I was interested to read the director level duty regarding climate change and the 1.5 degrees. I mean, we have a case in Uganda, you might know about it, of Total, who are moving ahead with a large investment in a new oil project, which will see them be part of the construction of the largest heated oil pipeline in the world that will run from Uganda to Tanzania, and then the extraction of quite a lot of oil from the Lake Albert Basin over a period of 30 years, if this all goes ahead from 2025 or 2026. So I was just interested to know what way will that requirement work, and how will that be assessed? How do you assess one company's contribution to this, when there are obviously other companies involved, there are subsidiaries involved, there's the Ugandan government, there's a Chinese national oil company, very complex issue. How will that be assessed, and how will the French regulator assess whether Total is, or the directors of Total are meeting that duty, if and when this oil project goes ahead, which would obviously see the company and Uganda contributing much more to carbon emissions because of the release of much more carbon from the burning of all of this oil that will come out of the ground. So just very interested to know if there are any details on how that will actually work in practice. Sebastian, I think you're muted.
Yeah, apologies. It always happens once, maybe. Yeah, thank you for the feedback on the question and the feedback. I think it's good for colleagues to hear developments at country level, especially on your side, because you have favorable political dynamics, which you've been using, and you've been able to expand your work on the topic. So I think for this was quite useful, and also to hear about the coordination with member states and the fact that you can also have Team Europe approach at local level. With regard to your question, I think it's quite difficult. It's quite legalistic. So for the proposal itself, like due diligence doesn't cover adverse climate change impacts. So the Paris Agreement is not part of the environmental convention listed in the annex. So that's one part. With regards to climate change, so companies have to adopt a plan to make sure that their strategy still limits global warming to 1.5. So in line with the Paris Agreement. So this is where the agreement comes back in terms of expectations. So they have to include as objective emission reduction. And this duty is only subject to administrative supervision only. So how would companies report this? I'm not fully expert, but big companies like Total, they have their sustainability strategies. And actually for the environment, it's quite straightforward, because you could have science-based targets saying that I will reduce by 2030 my emissions by 40%. And then I'll go carbon neutral by 2050, depending where the competition is or the commitment of the companies are. You have to prove through reporting that you're actually attaining these targets. So I think on the environmental side, that's kind of the strength compared to human rights, is that you could actually report it on it more straightforward. Now, in terms of the Total case, it's also linked to the French law, devoir de vigilance, where the company should already have put in place a plan to set up the due diligence process, and then the courts can assess if they've breached or didn't fulfill the requirement in that plan. So I think there's also the question of, we have a pending EU proposal that is yet to be adopted, but you already have a French law which is ongoing. So I don't know in detail the requirements of the French law. I know that companies have to preemptively draft a plan, and then this is assessed against in terms of how much progress they have they have reached. So this would be my answer, that actually for emissions, it would be specific targets set by the companies, and then you could, if it's brought into court, you could confront the companies for not having abide to their scientific targets. I also think that the case, maybe you can correct me there, but involves environmental commitments, but also how they've dealt with the displacement of local population. So I think that's another consideration, which is more human rights based, that is discussed at court level. So I think, and it's also one of the advantages of having a due diligence proposal that covers both human rights and environmental ground, is that there are many approaches that you can actually assess progress of the company, but also for claimants to actually bring their case in court. So maybe you could also provide details there, but that would be my answer. I don't know, Dan, if you want to come in as well, or Katal, if you want to comment or give us more detail about this court case, because it's quite important. It has a lot of visibility in France, and there's a judgment in favor. So I think it's good for colleagues to hear about it more in detail.
Yeah, thanks, Sebastian. Just very briefly, you're right. There are a set of issues related to how and whether Total did its upfront due diligence and consultations with communities. There have been a range of allegations and issues related to displacement without adequate compensation, and other issues related to the intimidation and harassment of human rights defenders in the area that the oil is being or will be extracted. Total, for its part, says that it has complied with all of its requirements. It denies any involvement in human rights abuses, and it's been, I would say, quite proactive in developing policies around, its interaction with civil society, human rights defenders, all of that. But nevertheless, a group of NGOs, as you say, have taken Total Energies to court in France under the duty of vigilance law. It was an initial judgment against them, but then there was a higher court decision that indeed the court in France could consider the case under that law. So I think it's still ongoing. It's still to be determined what way it will go, but it's definitely there, and the issue is quite prominent, not just in France, but I think globally through the Stop ECOP campaign. And so it's quite controversial. Total is putting a lot of resources into responding to this, and so it is definitely on the one hand an environmental issue, but also very much a human rights issue as well. And it remains to be seen how it plays out. But I think aside from the court case, whatever way that goes, I mean, I think there are still a lot of very serious issues on the ground, and not all of them just related to Total, also related to the government and to the Chinese oil company as well. So it's consuming a lot of people's time here, and will definitely continue to in the next number of years. And that's why I think it's important. And I have to say that Total have already engaged with us in a lot of conversations we have had on the business and human rights agenda. And they're one of the companies that I think see a lot of value in that conversation. So I'll leave it there.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's a very interesting case because it also reflects the importance of access to remedy, like the power of having specific cases coming up. And now with this legislation, you build up the extraterritorial link so that claimants could bring the case to the country where the company is based. So in case of Total, would be in France. And then in terms of reputational risk, or also visibility that it brings forward, it's sometimes more of an issue for the company than the actual legal outcomes, which of course will take many years and involves a lot of lawyer fees, which for the company are negligible, but for affected communities are real legal hurdles. And this is also one of the sensitive points of this proposal by the Commission, is that the burden of proof is not really reversed. and this is something that has been brought up by the parliament. So this is like a quick reaction. And in terms of programming, and I think with our human rights or civil society thematic programming, I think it's something that we could cover more, support of CSOs in terms of investigation, but also support to victims and bringing court cases forward. This is something that we're gonna aim for under the global funding, and of course this can also feed the policy process of how the law will be implemented, because we can also suppose that court cases, as they evolve, also build up a jurisprudence that also defines or shape the law further down the road. And we've seen this with actually this case of Total in France, that because the case was introduced, then there was specific appreciation to with regards to what approach the court should have on the case, and who should be entitled to actually pronounce an ordeal. So it also further details how, I mean, it's more legal and technical terms, but it does have an impact. I see we have a few minutes left. Javier, you want to have the floor, and I don't see other questions, so I'll let it for you to finish.
Okay, thanks, Sebastian. Thanks for the questions. Just maybe one word, because the colleague from Ugandan delegation, you make important remarks on issues that you are seeing. I mean, one of them is that you have seen a low level of awareness of companies. This is something we have also identified, and depending on the context, because in the European Union, large companies are, let's say, becoming more and more aware and actually pushing for this agenda to have a more legal certainty, level playing field, etc. But we have seen that it's not. The level of awareness is not, let's say, harmonized. It's not consistent, depending on type of sector, type of company. Yeah, so I think it's important also your role as delegation to let's say, convey these messages and explain what are the developments that are happening internationally and EU level. So in this regard, well, I would like to mention two elements. One is that because Sebastian referred to the toolkit that was on business and human rights that was recently produced. There was also another document that was produced a bit earlier, or I would say two documents. One is a narrative that together with the Commission, EAS, and the Commission services working on this file, we developed for you to, as a line to take, and with a mapping of initiatives, so you're aware of, let's say, key messages in this regard. And another document that was produced early on was a reference document, what we call a reference document for delegations, indicating possible actions that you can undertake for promoting the implementation of the guiding principles in third countries. So, I mean, we're happy to share those if they are not available or you don't have it handy, but they were sent head of delegation level because this is an issue and this is also a message we wanted to pass. It's important coordination between sections on this file because it has a very clear development aspect, but also it's really work for political sections and I would say trade sections. So this is one of the issues that we want to address with the initiative I mentioned at the beginning, with EU comprehensive framework on implementation of the guiding principle, because we see that there is scope, there is room for improvement in terms of coordination between, let's say, with member states here in Brussels, but also you refer to some initiatives like some countries being particularly active. So I think it will be important also to coordinate at your level of delegations with embassies, and it's happening in some places, but we will provide what are best practices in this regard, so everyone is aware of what can be done. So just to mention that this is some of the outcomes that you can expect from this process that we have started to better implement guiding principles. But it's just a reaction, and just to thank for the feedback that you provided on the implementation of the business human rights and delegation. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Javier. I think we'll leave it today, but the link with policy dialogue is very important, because at some point the legislation, we can expect that we have to engage not only with third partner countries about the forthcoming legislation, but also with businesses. And this is where the delegation will turn more into also some kind of chamber of commerce, and have to interact and do awareness raising and discussing also when there are specific cases coming up. So I think this is an important point. We'll put all these documents in the SharePoint link that I have just added in the chat, including the PowerPoint presentation, so that you have all the tools and documents to refer to if you need to draft briefings, special line to takes, or also if you're thinking of doing some programming in this area. I think there's a lot of resources there that you could use and help you down the road. So with this, I'll close the session. Many thanks for your participation and questions, and hopefully this was helpful for you. Thank you very much.